The day had been long, and the weight of the world seemed to rest heavily on Michael's shoulders as he boarded the evening train. The cold air outside bit at his skin, and the soft, rhythmic clattering of the train's wheels on the tracks offered a strange comfort. It was a familiar routine, one he had followed countless times before, an unremarkable journey home. But tonight, something felt different. As he found his seat, Michael noticed that the train was quieter than usual. Normally, the late-night rides were filled with the sounds of tired commuters, the faint hum of conversations, and the rustling of newspapers. Tonight, however, there was nothing. The car he entered was almost empty, and the few passengers scattered across the cabin sat motionless, their eyes unfocused and glazed. An unsettling chill crept over him, but Michael shrugged it off. Perhaps it was just the exhaustion, or the stress of his hectic life catching up with him. He settled into his seat, but the silence around him seemed to stretch endlessly. The train had begun moving, but there was no sign of the usual landmarks passing by. Instead, the darkened landscape outside the window was eerily still, as if the world had vanished. Michael sat back in his seat, his mind drifting as the train rattled along its tracks. The strange emptiness of the cabin weighed on him, and he found himself glancing over at the other passengers, hoping for some sign of life. They were all sitting perfectly still, staring straight ahead with no expression on their faces. It was as though they weren't even aware of their surroundings. He tried clearing his throat, but the sound was unnaturally loud in the stillness. No one reacted. He shifted uncomfortably, deciding to walk down the aisle. Maybe he could find a conductor or someone to explain the unsettling silence. But as he passed the rows of vacant seats, the air grew even colder, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. There were no signs of movement. The passengers remained frozen, as if caught in a deep trance. When he reached the front of the car, Michael approached the door to the next one, but it was locked. Frowning, he moved on to the door leading to the train's driver. It too was locked. Strange, he thought. Normally, the doors between cars were always open, and a conductor would always be walking around. He pressed his ear to the door, but all he could hear was the muffled sound of the train's wheels rolling over the tracks. No voices. No footsteps. Just the eerie hum of machinery. Something wasn't right. Michael turned away from the locked doors, his frustration growing. His hands trembled slightly as he wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. Was it just exhaustion? Or was something more sinister happening here? He walked back toward the empty seats, his eyes scanning the motionless passengers once more. But this time, one of them was different. Near the middle of the car, a woman sat upright, her eyes focused on him. Unlike the others, her gaze wasn't vacant. There was a clarity to it, a knowing, as if she saw something beyond the surface of the world they shared. As their eyes met, she gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Are you okay?" Michael asked hesitantly, his voice breaking the unnatural silence. The woman didn't answer immediately. She studied him for a moment, her lips twitching into a sad smile. "I don't know," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm not sure you are." Michael frowned, unsettled. He glanced around the car, but no one else had moved, still frozen in their trance-like states. What is this place?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Where are we going?" Her expression darkened. "We're not going anywhere. Not anymore." She glanced down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, as if the truth was too much to bear. "We're dead," she finally whispered, her voice heavy with sorrow. "And so are you." Michael's breath caught in his throat. What do you mean?" But before she could reply, the train jolted, and the lights flickered above them. The train shook violently, throwing Michael off balance for a moment. He grabbed the nearest seat to steady himself, heart pounding in his chest. The woman's words echoed in his mind, "We're dead. And so are you." Dead? Was this some kind of nightmare? It couldn't be real. He must have hit his head or passed out, but the coldness of the air, the stillness of the train, everything felt so real. He shook his head, trying to focus, but that's when it happened. The first vision came rushing in, overwhelming him. Suddenly, he was no longer on the train. He was standing in his childhood home, a memory from years ago, one he hadn't thought about in ages. He watched his younger self, a boy no older than 10, running through the house, laughing with his sister. Their mother called them from the kitchen, her voice warm and inviting. The memory was so vivid, so real, it was as though he was living it again. But then, like a switch had flipped, the scene changed. The house was empty. The laughter had faded, replaced by the deafening silence of a place long abandoned. His sister's face was twisted in fear as she disappeared into the darkness, her final words echoing in his mind. "You weren't there when I needed you." The vision broke, and Michael was back on the train, gasping for breath. His chest ached as the weight of the memory crushed him. What was happening? Why was he reliving this moment now? Michael's heart raced as the echoes of his sister's words lingered in his ears. The cold sweat on his brow seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. He had seen that scene before, many years ago. It had been a painful memory, one he had buried deep inside himself. He had failed her. He hadn't been there when she needed him most, and the guilt had haunted him ever since. But the vision wasn't over. Another memory began to unfold before him, as if the train was pulling him through the darkest corners of his life. This time, he was standing in the hospital room, watching his mother on her deathbed. The sterile smell of the room, the beeping of the machines, it all came rushing back, drowning him in the feeling of helplessness. He had been there for her, but had he really been present? Or had he been consumed by his own selfish concerns, too lost in his own life to truly be with her in her final moments? The vision shifted again, and Michael found himself back in the present, on the train, surrounded by the silent passengers. The weight of his regrets pressed heavily against him, suffocating him. He wanted to speak, to shout, to beg for forgiveness, but no words came. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him now, their gaze heavy and accusing, as if they could see into his very soul. The woman from earlier appeared again, her sad smile never leaving her face. She spoke softly, her voice a whisper in the stillness of the train. "Do you see now? You've always been running from your own mistakes. But you can't outrun them anymore." The woman's words cut through him like a blade, and Michael staggered back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His mind spun, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he was still on the train or lost somewhere in his own tortured thoughts. Everything felt disjointed, surreal. The train, the passengers, none of it made sense. He looked around, his eyes searching for something, anything, that might offer an explanation. That's when he noticed something he hadn't before: the windows. They weren't fogged by condensation or dirt. They were clear, yet the outside world was absent. There was no sky, no landscape, just an infinite darkness, stretching on forever. The train wasn't moving through space, but through a void, an endless tunnel with no exit. The woman stepped forward, her face shadowed by a deep sorrow, but her eyes never left his. "You're in between," she said softly. "This train, it's not taking you anywhere. It's taking you through your own regrets, your past mistakes. This is where we all end up." Michael's chest tightened as he tried to make sense of her words. "But why? Why am I here? What's happening?" "This train," she continued, her voice laced with a quiet sadness, "is a place of reckoning. The dead who board it must face their lives before they can move on. But some never do. They're trapped, just like you." The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a train. It was a purgatory. A limbo where souls had to come to terms with their past, before they could find peace. And Michael had boarded it unknowingly, condemned to relive his mistakes until he found a way to accept them. "You're not the first," she said, almost as if reading his mind. "And you won't be the last." Michael stood frozen, the weight of the woman's words pressing down on him. His mind was racing. This couldn't be real. He had to be dreaming. But the train, the coldness, the overwhelming sense of doom, it all felt too real. His thoughts spiraled into confusion. The truth was undeniable now. He was dead. But what did that mean for him? Was he condemned to wander this endless train forever, trapped in the purgatory of his own regrets? The train lurched, and suddenly the doors opened, revealing a long hallway at the end of the car. The woman stepped aside, as if inviting him to walk through. Michael hesitated. He wanted to ask her questions, to demand answers, but there was no time. She simply stood there, her face as sad as ever, waiting for him to make his decision. He could feel the weight of the choices before him. He could continue running, ignore the truth of his past, and remain on the train forever, an endless cycle of self-loathing and regret. Or he could step into the unknown, face what he had done, and finally come to terms with the mistakes that had haunted him for so long. The woman's voice, soft and steady, cut through his thoughts. The choice is yours. But remember, this is the last chance you'll get. Michael took a deep breath, his hands trembling. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped forward, toward the unknown. The hallway stretched before him, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. Michael's heart raced, his every step echoing in the silence. He didn't know what awaited him at the end of this corridor, but there was no turning back now. His mind kept circling back to the same question. Would accepting his fate finally bring him peace? Or would it trap him here forever, like so many before him? As he walked, the sound of his footsteps grew louder, almost deafening, until it drowned out everything else. The world outside the train, the haunting memories, even the woman's presence, it all faded into the background. The weight of his regrets was still there, pressing down on him, but now it felt like a distant hum, something he could no longer escape. At the end of the hallway, Michael came to a door. It was simple, unadorned, but somehow he knew it was the doorway to his final choice. The choice to face his past or to remain in the eternal loop of this purgatory. He reached out, his hand trembling as he gripped the handle. For the first time, he understood what the woman had meant. He had to let go. He had to accept the mistakes that had defined him, the failures he had never reconciled. Only then could he move on. With a deep breath, Michael turned the handle. And that concludes our story. But what do you think really happened? Was there a way out, or was it all inevitable? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more chilling stories. Your support helps keep these tales coming. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.